So with us today, we have the expert panel from VREF. We have Mr. Ken Dufour, Mr. Jason Zilberbrand, Mr. Neil Fulbright, Mr. Neil Schiller, and Dr. Andreas Grossel. Gentlemen, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Well, thank you. Oh,
Excellent. And before we get started, here's our agenda for today. We'll start off with the commercial airline Bioshock. Then we'll go to business and leisure travel, as well as mitigating COVID-19. The third section will be quarantines and social distancing and how general aviation can help. In the fourth section, the alternatives to airlines, including charter, fractional, and outright ownership. Then we'll have a European and Oceanic Pacific market update. And then finally, we'll talk about the vacation season and going back to the 1950s. So we'll get right into it, the commercial airline block, talking about the new regulations. Ken, can you help us understand what new regulations have been put in place by the airlines and the TSA?
well, we're still seeing some changes in that environment, and I'm not sure we're to fruition yet to see what's going to transpire, but we know there's going to be a lot of restrictions, a lot of new onsense coming to that travel environment, which is going to make it much more cumbersome for a passenger to be able to use air transport or airline aviation in the future. It's going to be difficult for them to get on board, to stay on board, but also to the destination. When they get to where they're going, it's going to be problematic if they can get housing and transportation from there. So the whole sector, because of COVID, is complicated, and I don't think there's some good solutions right now. The air transport world is still struggling with that, and it's probably going to be still a few more months before we get a good, clear-cut resolution of what that travel environment is going to look like.
And how do you think people are going to feel in general about the screening process as they fly?
Well, the folks I've talked to, and of course, in my opinion, there are going to be some medical issues that are going to have to be addressed in the TSA screening process, as well as getting on aboard any airplane. It's going to be cumbersome. It's going to be problematic. It's going to be difficult. And I believe it's going to shy a lot of people away from the segment. And hopefully that will continue to push them down into corporate business aviation and general aviation.
And you think, will people be concerned about not being able to get home if they do test positive?
Well, that's one of the big parameters. If you have been tested positive, you will probably be isolated and quarantined for 14 days, possibly in a remote location. And that has got to be the nightmare of all nightmares. So it's going to be very difficult to be able to make that, coming and going round trip segment in the airlines. It's going to be very, very cumbersome.
And I saw something about possibly having scheduled bathroom visits on board. Is that serious from the airlines, or is that just a response to the media?
Again, I think it's still being derived, and they're still working on, the proper protocol. I don't think the protocol is there yet.
Does anyone have any comments about the Boeing CEO suggestion that one of the majors will not make it through?
The Boeing CEO characterizes it as a new reality. And I believe between the air transport travel problems, the 737 MAX issues, those are all going to have an effect. And to answer your question, Chris, we will probably see one or more over the globe, international airlines and domestic airlines. We will probably lose one or two, if not more, and probably precipitate some more consolidation of those companies. It said that Delta and United are burning through $50 to $60 million of cash a day.
A day. Not a month. A day. And
with limited operations and no real, return on their investment.
Plus, I think you've got some issues regarding, whether or not the airlines are domestic focused or international focused. And I think there's a way different perspective going on when you have, international travel, especially if you're in Europe. I think a lot of countries that have depended on tourism for a long time as their main source of revenue are going to be facing some difficult times. And we'll get more into this later, but I think, the big issue that the airlines are dealing with is just, how do you fill seats when nobody wants to fly? And what do you do with all these routes? What do you do with all the overcapacity of all these aircraft? And I think you've seen, at least short term, they're getting parked. I know Neil Schiller's been dealing with a lot of the Virgin equipment down in Australia. I mean, and it's all public knowledge, but there's, 100 aircraft, 90 some odd aircraft impacted just by that alone.
Yeah, just from our perspective in this part of the world, we've had one of two airlines. There's two major carriers and then a third regional, Virgin. As Jason just mentioned, it's in voluntary administration or Chapter 11 equivalent. There's 4 interested parties looking to try and resurrect the airline. And they're trying to whittle that down to 2 over the next 2 or 3 weeks. And then you've got Qantas sitting there with most of its aircraft parked up as well. Just yesterday, they announced when they start to get a few more aircraft, few more aircraft back into the air, new protocols for how we're going to travel, sort of touching on what Ken said. There will be contactless check-ins. They're going to automate just about everything. Deeper cleaning between flights, not quite regulated time in the toilet, but they'll be discouraging you to using the facilities, give everyone wipes for the seats, and they seem to have a pretty good plan. We don't really know what cash they're burning a day, but it'd be in the tens of millions of dollars because there's so many aircraft parked up. And our version of the Mojave Desert car park is we've got one in Central Australia, which is full of international and domestic aircraft as well, out at Alice Springs.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is we just have never seen anything like this in the airline world. I mean, we've seen, fleet groundings, we've seen safety issues, but we've never seen a global impact like this.
Yeah, speaking of what Jason's talking about, but the fleet groundings, we had after 9/11, the airlines, they kind of got rid of all of their older legacy aircraft, and then they were able to rebuild with the newer, more fuel efficient aircraft. And now we just saw a major U.S. carrier ground all of its 777s while the 777s are still in production. So that's kind of unprecedented.
If I may, something
$65,000. What happens, right? What happens to the values? Where do we go with a whole bunch of aircraft that get parked for a very long time?
Lufthansa said that they are losing about 25 million euros a day. They've parked 90% of their fleet. They have some domestic routes at the moment. And today it came out that they will be bailed out by the government. The Republic of Germany will take 25% of the shares plus 1 vote, which gives them a blocking minority. And they are talking about 9 billion euros in relief payments or guarantees for loans for Lufthansa. And Lufthansa says that they will not be back to normal before 2023. And they are considering of retiring about 10% of their fleet. And there was a regional airline in the Lufthansa group that stopped operations, said they will not come back. They filed for bankruptcy. British Airways is looking to cut the wages of their employees by 50%. They are now fighting with the unions. Air France is not quite clear what they're really doing. Alitalia, which was in deep trouble, will be nationalized. And the other no-frills airlines like Wizz Air or Ryanair, they still say they will come out stronger. But as you already mentioned, nobody wants to fly at the moment. And we have to see in Central Europe, we have about 50% of our workforce either unemployed or in short time. And if you're on short time or unemployed, you don't think about making holidays, but the majority of those airlines was flying tourists around. So we do not really see where this will end. And I do not see a very brilliant future for the airline industry in Europe.
Well, plus Andreas, most of the summer travel is tourism revenue for Europe.
And what we have to see, we still have travel bans. So private travel, cross-border travel for private purposes in Europe is still not allowed. And we are 25 very small countries. So within an hour driving, you cross borders. So cross-border travel is completely out of sight. They are considering to open it in June or July, but there are others fighting it, saying, listen, only for tourism. We do not endanger our safety and our health. because in Europe we are back to zero infections. So everybody wants to keep the borders closed to keep their population healthy. And this is exactly what you do not need when you want to go on holidays. So before June or July, I think there will be more or less no airline travel in Europe. I don't see that.
This seems like a perfect time to segue to the second section about business and leisure travel. Obviously, we have Part 135 charters and alternatives like outright ownership to get the economy back on track. Do you see companies flying like they once did with that constant business travel, or is it going to shift dramatically the same way the passenger market has?
So from the folks that I'm talking to, corporate aviation flight departments in the U.S., they've been limited in terms of their ability to move and certainly fly. It doesn't mean they're not exercising the aircraft on a regular basis, but in terms of business trips, my understanding is there's not a whole lot of that happening yet. Some of that is coming back, but for the most part, my understanding is most of the aircraft, if they are being operated for flights, it's for management, recreational type purposes. And there's not a whole lot of business activity going on. And then I think that that's going to head into really the big decisions that a lot of corporations are going to have to make, and whether or not productivity is going to suffer from lack of face-to-face meetings, and how you compensate, for all of that. And I think this is a perfect example as to how you can be productive and not have to leave your home or your office. So, yeah, I imagine there's going to be a lot less, business travel, but that should be compensated by leisure, right? So, I mean, you're going to have people who are going to need to go places. The question is whether or not they're going to utilize the airlines. And I think, at least right now, it appears that there's a whole bunch of folks trying to figure out, does fractional ownership make sense? Does a smaller aircraft make sense? Where are you really going? I think a lot of people are going to start changing the way that they look at travel. And, this goes to one of the segments later on, back to the 50s. But I mean, the real question is whether or not people are going to go buy a trailer and travel in the U.S. by car, or if they're going to buy a piston airplane and try and do it, or if they're not just going to, they just won't go at all. But I think you're going to see local domestic travel. That'll be the first step to recovery.
The problem is what happens when you get there, and the restrictions in that state for restaurants and moving around. So we can get them there and they can conduct their business, but where do they stay unless it's a day trip?
When a big corporation moves middle management for a meeting and somebody has a fever and can't get back on the plane, what do you do from an insurance standpoint? What do you do from how do you protect your staff? These are all the questions that are going on. It's people.
And that's part of the problem. It's not just about the travel and accessibility, but also there are a lot of now legal issues being brought forward about employees and employees' rights, and as well as their HIPAA medical standards. And what do you do with them if they get infected, or who's going to pay for it? We just had a discussion this morning about opening up Embry-Riddle on a test basis for our summer semester. And most of the conversation was about employees and contractors and professors and staff, about how we protect them as well as the students. And it gets extremely complicated very, very quickly.
You got a huge liability issue on your hands.
Correct. It seems like we have two sides of this. Like right now, on the one side, we have countries being shut down, people having to take, blood tests to go on vacation, very strict standards. But then we also see people in some areas, like say California and Florida, where they're attempting to return to normal, going to the beach, leaving their masks at home. Do you think that is going to have like a regional difference? Are there going to be people in some areas that are willing to head to the airport and hop on Southwest, for example?
That's a great question. I mean, I think everybody's got a different perspective based on where they live. The unique situation here is we've got people from, both coasts and from other countries. And I can tell you from the Midwest perspective, I'm in Illinois with Ken. Our local government has taken this to the complete extreme. We're still locked down. They're saying that there's probably a good chance we're not going to be let go the end of the month. June 1 is kind of that magic date. Whether or not they say, you can go back and do your thing, I don't know that that's going to happen. I think the longer that we're locked up, the more permanent the damage is. But I also think that some of it is age related. You know, I think the younger generations are going to be more, quick to recover. They're going to shake this off, or at least that's what I'm seeing. You know, the people that are out certainly are younger and, appear to be, at least not too concerned. And I think that that's a really unique situation with this because there are two very different opinions. You know, I think there's one group that really believes that this virus is, incredibly dangerous and therefore should be taken incredibly seriously. And I think there's a whole nother group of people that just don't believe that it is. And I think that's why you're seeing such a huge difference maybe on the coast reaction.
And speaking to the idea of the quarantines and social distancing, how can general aviation play a part in this? Like, how can aviation providers assist in this process for passengers and owners and operators?
I mean, the obvious answer to that is that you're not exposed to the very, situation that causes the problem, which is large gatherings, right? So, an airliner by design carries sometimes hundreds of passengers. And then you're being exposed in a very close confined, situation where you're sharing that cabin. General aviation, you typically are an owner operator. You're going to be with your family. You're going to know everybody that's inside the cabin. And then it would be up to you to handle your protocols to whether or not you would even, contemplate dealing with somebody who you have not been in close contact with and let them travel with you. But I think, this goes back to, how people used to travel, 30, 40, 50 years ago. They didn't travel internationally. Most people never left their town. I think you're going to see, hopefully is the case, is that piston aircraft pick up, the slack. People are still going to need to travel. And I think a lot of people have relied on these aircraft for a very long time, even in the business sector. Unbeknownst to a lot of people, business jets get, for obvious reasons, they get all the limelight. But the workhorses are the turboprops and the piston aircraft, and they have been for a very long time.
So in Europe, it's a good example. We have 70 different set of rules for how to cope with the COVID-19. And most of the countries have protocols in place where they can issue a permit for travel, for business travel. And the way how they like people to travel is on private aircraft, because they can come into a place, make their business and go back the same day. And they say there are only 3 or 4 people aboard. And this doesn't spread the virus like an airliner with 200, 250 people. And we have a Pilatus PC-12 operator, IFR, single engine IFR is allowed now in Europe, also for commercial operations. And they are fully booked until next month for business travel to the Ukraine, to Switzerland, to Germany, wherever, simply because it's the only way how they can travel, and they get the permits and they fly. But they only fly high profile members of the board and not the average employees at the moment, also for those liability questions that you already mentioned. But I think this shows that the small aircraft, turboprops, that they are still really valuable travel tools.
And speaking about these alternatives, does anyone have any thoughts on chartering or fractional ownership or even outright ownership of airlines?
I mean, I think the question that I've been hearing from some folks is that, obviously, you're going to see people start to seek out ways of flying. I mean, I've had friends for the last, 3 or 4 weeks bombarding me with questions about alternatives to airlines. And I think it's a really cool situation that's going on right now. And I think people are seeking that information out because they're afraid of the airlines. I think businesses will as well. When, and it's an unfortunate situation, but as everybody on the panel will attest, typically, big company, the first thing to go when times get tough is the aircraft. The business jets are the first things to go. For those that were around in 08 and 09 and witnessed the last recession, we certainly saw a fair share of flight departments shut down. That doesn't mean they're not operating any longer, or not flying privately. It just means they don't own their own aircraft. Certainly the fractional companies are set up today to handle supplemental lift, and they have been for a long time. I think the big question right now is, will the fractional companies be able to implement regulations that won't hamper their ability to move people? Meaning, are people going to be open to getting screened, with a fractional operator like they would with the airline. And I still think that there is a, big enough segment of at least the US population from a privacy standpoint, I think Europeans too, that are not going to go if they're going to be subjected to blood tests and temperature taking and run the risk of not being able to get home. Nobody wants to go and get stuck with, a 14-day quarantine on the road.
And we've seen this with like VistaJet and some others actually testing crew and passengers before the flight. Do you think that'll make people feel safer or more concerned, like you're saying, that they can't come back home?
I think it depends on the audience. I think for the most part, business aviation, that demographic is very sophisticated, highly educated. I think they understand that VistaJet is doing this to protect, their operations. They're trying to protect their employees. And I do think that there's a lot of this going on. And Andreas, speak up, because I know that you've been dealing with a lot of this too, from your client base. But you've got an issue here where you have people who are afraid to travel because they're scared of catching a virus, and then you have companies who are trying to protect staff that need to work. And how do you, potentially put somebody in harm's way, right? So you have this major liability issue right now that I think everybody is trying to determine. How hard do you push somebody to go back to the workplace? And that's really the question. And I think it's up to the individual. I think there's going to be a lot of people that just won't return to the workplace because they're afraid. And I think that there's a lot of people who are going to say, you know what, I'm okay with it and I'll go. So I think, the VistaJets and the NetJets are doing the right thing by testing. I think the people that we deal with on a daily basis that would have the means of being able to afford a business jet, ticket, for lack of a better term, they're expecting them to step up and do something to protect everybody so that we don't, continue to spread this thing.
The expectation of the people traveling is different from where they are from. If you are in countries where you have a very developed healthcare system, like in Central Europe, people are no longer willing to be subjected to such tests. In Austria, we have now 40 people in intensive care out of 9 million inhabitants. Comparable figures in Switzerland and southern Germany. And we have less than 1,000 people infected. So everybody says, well, we have overcome this. Why do we continue with all those measures? And in other countries like Italy or France, with a healthcare system that is really down and has been down for many decades, the view may be different. And that's, I think, the problem. And that's also the problem that people say, what does testing do for me when I arrive somewhere where I may get quarantined or whatever? So I think it really depends on the experience, and it's a very, very local thing. So there is no simple answer to the question. It really depends on where you're from and what your personal experience and the experience of your society was with the virus.
No, it's true. I mean, I read an article this morning that suggested some countries will go to a 60-day, 30-day quarantine schedule. So you'll have 60 days of freedom and then 30 days of being locked up. I mean, don't forget, flu season's right around the corner again, guys. So how will someone decipher from a temperature over 101 or whatever their cutoff is from a flu versus, the COVID flu? I mean, I think you're going to be dealing with a whole bunch of issues that are going to be compounding themselves as we get, further on into this.
And still, we do not really know really much about this virus. I read a very interesting article. Mr. Penning, an Austrian who is the head of the virus department in British Columbia, he is one of the leading researchers in COVID-19 at the moment. And he said they found out that you are infected with the virus, you don't have any symptoms, but you can spread the virus. So there are so many questions open of which measures really are necessary, which are scientifically based and which not. And everybody tries to reinvent the wheel at the moment. And so aviation is in the hands of people who have nothing to do with aviation in reality.
And looking at that projection about how aviation may look in 3 years, maybe Neil, we can start with you. Does the new technology and the new limitations mean more costly upgrades in the future? Because we've seen the internet push to its limits with spamming and phishing emails at their highest level. Do you think aircraft are going to need more secure networks and new infrastructure as well?
that security is never, that's going to grow exponentially. There's no way around that. It's, and we're even having that at home right now with your cybersecurity, cyber hygiene. So on the airplanes, those are open networks that you have to secure. They're tied to the main business. So that security, every time we make an advancement in technology, it opens the door for a security issue, and then we have to try to catch up with that security issue. So that's one of the biggest growing fields right now is cybersecurity. It's like a zero unemployment rate, even with this in cybersecurity. And the same thing applies to the aircraft networks.
Gotcha. And Ken, what do you think about the singles and the twins in the last decade of appreciation? Is that going to continue, or are we going to see a plateau in that as well?
Well, certain segments of that general aviation have slightly increased, especially the small flight training market portion of it. I believe, as we've been talking here, as we see an increased demand for some of this upper level, mid-level general aviation, I think that there are going to be less airplanes for sale. The value is going to firm up, and it's going to be kind of like the old days. It's going to be hard to find given airplanes or good airplanes to be able to acquire.
Gotcha. And Jason, you covered this a bit already with the biz jet market, but do you have a forecast for the next 3 years with business jet aviation?
So the business jet market, I think, is the one that unfortunately is going to suffer near term. I think long term, everything will obviously work itself out. But near term, I think you're going to see more pressure on the larger aircraft segment of business jets. Certainly anything that, 4,000 nautical or greater, I think is going to have, some issues in the near term. But the flip side to that is that, we are still seeing a tremendous amount of closings. And I think it's running, across single engine pistons all the way through kind of like a mid-size business jet. Mid-size business aircraft are closing, jets are closing. I just think the issue you have right now is how big of an aircraft can you afford to purchase as a high net worth individual? Because I think it's pretty safe to say right now, corporate acquisitions are going to be sidelined for the moment. They're going to be paused. It doesn't mean they're not going to happen. They're just going to be paused for a little bit. I think a lot of high net worth individuals that are trying to buy right now are also contemplating whether or not they should hit that pause button. I think general consumer response to something like this is, even if I need it, do I want to buy it to have it sit? You want to buy it to operate it. So I think a lot of people that are in the market for business aircraft, they'll close as soon as they can go somewhere, or as soon as they feel comfortable that, the aircraft's just not going to sit. The banks that I'm dealing with on a daily basis are lending. So there's really not much change in terms of the financial, market environment. And I think that there's been, an uptick in interest in a lot of the aircraft that, have been ignored for quite some time, whether that's older single twin engine turboprops and the twin engine, fixed piston. Those markets are actually doing pretty good right now. And like Ken said, I mean, the single engine and single engine complex market they're just hot. I mean, there's no slowing it down. I think I talked to Diamond this morning. They still have like an 18-month backlog across the board. Most of the manufacturers that we deal with, they have backlogs. You run into trouble, with the longer range business jets. And honestly, this was a year where you were going to see a lot of this anyway. It has been accelerated by COVID to some degree, but I think everybody needs to remember that this is an election year and that there's a lot at stake. And the summer historically has been very slow in business aviation. We typically don't see a lot of closings during the summer months. That's when people are typically traveling. So you're going to have a slowdown this summer, in the business jet market. But I expect it to come, roaring back to some degree, because I think, people are going to be dealing with, alternatives to the airlines. And there's no better substitute than, if you can afford it, to having your own business jet.
Gotcha. And Andreas, you talked about this a bit with the European response. Do you think there's going to be a change in the new aircraft sales or the pre-owned market in Europe, or even the divide between the UK and the EU, giving more opportunities?
Yeah, I think so. What we see at the moment, as Jason said, we still see closings. We still see the banks lending. We still see people shopping for aircraft. to some extent, I have the impression here in Europe that they start testing out how soft the market became. But I think for Europe, it is the only chance to have some sort of transportation. And there are a lot of people around who are wealthy enough to afford aircraft. And it's the only way how they can travel in the foreseeable future. And regarding the Brexit, we still do not know what will be the outcome. Britain announced that they will definitely leave EASA at the end of the year. So even if there is some agreement with the European Union to continue the free market or a tax or duty-free zone, so they definitely will not continue here. This will be a good chance for European operators that were based in Britain or they had some business with Britain, that they will come back to Europe because they need to be able to operate within Europe to apply for EASA certificates. And I also think that the small aircraft market will come out stronger. The only question that I have is when really a lot of European airlines are cutting down on their fleet, what will be the pilots market in Europe? And this is directly linked to the training market. So we saw a lot of activity for trainers. Diamond is a leading manufacturer for trainers here. We still have backlogs also in Europe. But if the airlines can have enough pilots on the market, there is a need for training new pilots. So I'm not quite sure if this market for trainers will continue to be strong here because of the situation for European pilots. And don't forget, there are a lot of European pilots flying for Emirates, for Etihad, for all these carriers in the Arab world. And if they are hurt, first pilots that they will lay off is the foreigners. And so there will be a lot of European pilots coming back to Europe because they lose their jobs with major airlines in Asia or in the Arab world.
Great. And Neil, Australia has also faced some of these challenges, but from your perspective, do you see any unique response? Are you going to see people wanting to stay local on Australia as opposed to going abroad?
Well, look, I think there's plenty of people that would like to go abroad, but the issues that we've touched on before about, what happens if you get sick while you're away, or you get sick and you've got to come home. And not only that, we still got government enforced compulsory lockdown. So if you, or quarantines, if you do come into the country, you're straight from the airports to hotels, where you're basically locked in there for a fortnight. Currently, if you're an Australian coming back, the governments are funding that, but if you, for the foreseeable future, coming into the country, I think you'll have to fund it yourself. But more complicated than that in the domestic space is that we've got some borders closed from state to state. So I'm in New South Wales, we can travel freely into Victoria, but the border with Queensland to our north is closed. You can get there for business, but you need to go through jump through a few hoops to do so. So there is a little bit of business travel. You can see a few jets in the air, but very, very, very few. The corporate space in Australia is very small. I don't think there'll be any material impact out of there. It's largely driven, or the aircraft are owned by very wealthy individuals through their private companies. They run it as business jets for themselves and the occasional additional charter. Otherwise, you're servicing medical. So I think our market's going to remain fairly flat for some time until our internal borders get restrictions get removed. That's probably the overview. When whether you're in a smaller aircraft or a jet, there's just not that much travel going on. We'll be going back to what Jason was saying earlier, a lot of busman's holidays where we're going to be driving, but we can't drive, for example, across the county line into Queensland from here, and they're not encouraging it to going into Victoria on the south, albeit you can. And the we're moving into winter right now, so going north is fairly common. But but we'll probably go north and congregate on our Queensland border because in theory we're not allowed to cross it.
Gotcha. And I feel like we've covered a good chunk of the European and Oceanic Pacific market updates, but gentlemen, is there anything else, any other observations that perhaps we missed earlier?
Well, probably from our end, one maybe light that they're trying to create, light in the tunnel, is that hasn't got there yet, but Australia and New Zealand are trying to create a Pacific bubble, where sooner rather than later they want to open up that corridor for, which would be primarily leisure travel, but certainly business travel between Australia and New Zealand. Their rates are quite low. Australia's rates of infection and contraction now are decreasing. We're getting daily news updates on how many new cases we've got, and the recovery rate is increasing. So everything is sort of trending in the right direction. And that Pacific bubble, they had a conference with the Australian state leaders and Prime Minister and the New Zealand Prime Minister last week. And it's certainly something they're trying to do. How far away that is, I don't know, but it's certainly a light in the tunnel that doesn't exist in most other sectors.
We have to say is, what our politicians are telling us is that they see that they will open the borders in Europe in the foreseeable future, in particular between countries that already have coped well with the virus. But what everybody says is they do not see any international travel, meaning any travel going over the Atlantic Ocean or into Asia for the next months. So that means Europe will be cut off from the rest of the world for some weeks, if not months to come. And nobody can give you any idea, and it seems that the politicians don't really have a plan how to overcome this situation. But this is a very dangerous situation for our economy, because a lot of internationally operating corporations have to go overseas to do business. And it seems that nobody has a plan, or nobody does realize what this means if you cut off Europe from the rest of the world.
And Jason, you mentioned this earlier about possibly going back to the 1950s style of travel. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and I think what I mean by that is that people are going to, for those that have seen, Family Vacation, they're going to get the family trucks. They're going to load the kids and the dog and grandma, and they're going to hit the road. And I think there's something to be said for that. I think that, for a lot of people, just the thought of being able to get out of the house right after this quarantine ends, I think it's, it doesn't seem real right now, because for some places we've been locked up for so long. But I think people are very ready to leave. And I think the only way that people are going to do that and feel safe initially are going to be, in their car or, in an RV. And I think that's why sales in RVs have been surging. I think that's why there's been a lot of interest from a portion of the United States, at least, that had no interest in aviation, smaller aircraft. But yeah, I think you're going to see, a resurgence back to the way we used to travel, at least when my parents were growing up. And that was, you got in a car and, you went somewhere. And, when I was a kid, that's what we used to do. We used to go on family vacations by car. I think those that have kids and need to travel with children are probably going to be the last group to recover from this. I will tell you that there's nothing, you couldn't pay me any amount of money to drag, 2 toddlers through an airport, much less an international airport, being subjected to, having to wear masks and dealing with all of that. I think it's going to be a very frightening experience for a lot of younger people. And I think that's why, especially this summer, if we are able to travel, it's going to be local, and it's going to be, much like it was, 50 years ago.
And transitioning to this idea of the perfect storm, we've got high demand, we've got low interest rates, we've got low inventory. How long is this going to last, and what impact is that going to have on the future?
I mean, I think what you've got right now is the perfect storm to, the manufacturers should benefit long-term. There's no question. Once they get past this and they can get back to a normalized operational schedule where they're back to manufacturing aircraft instead of essential goods, I think that they're going to see a tremendous boom from the new aircraft side. I mean, don't forget, we didn't have a lot of aircraft coming in the business jet side, for the last 12 years. Deliveries have been down. Certainly it seems to be a trend and a pattern, new aircraft year to year seem to be dwindling. So this really is the shot in the arm, so to speak, that the business jet industry has been waiting for. And I think that combined, with what we saw last year with 2020 compliance and a whole bunch of aircraft coming off out of operation because of functional obsolescence, combined with the fact that we had an aging fleet. The trend in at least in the United States, we were trending towards older and older aircraft on average. So yeah, you're going to get a chance now to, the fleet's going to get younger. You're going to see a higher demand in aircraft. I think it's going to be pretty tough for a lot of people to find anything in the near future anyway. And I think, certain markets have been experiencing incredibly low inventory to the point where it's almost mind-boggling when you look at the total fleet size compared to how many, like-kind aircraft are for sale in one of those markets. It's pretty depleted. That should lead in a lot of markets to higher prices, higher values, shorter days on market. And then I think there's going to be a bunch of airplanes that have really struggled to find homes because they've got some sort of, problem or history to them. And I think that those aircraft will eventually find homes as well. I'm hearing people are willing to accept things that they normally wouldn't because the inventory is so low. So if things have been picked through already, what do you do in 60 or 90 days? What do you do come October when we head into buying season? A lot of aircraft close in the fourth quarter, for tax purposes. And we have a, pretty advantageous tax situation now as well, which we didn't talk about. So yeah, it's a great time to buy an airplane. It's probably not a great time to call your banker and try and get a home equity loan to buy an airplane. It's probably a slower response in terms of refis because I don't think a lot of banks can keep up with the demand, but the banks have money and they are lending. And likewise, I don't think there's been any slowdown from our perspective in terms of transactions.
And we've seen quite a bit of refinancing to do different things with the value of the airplane. I do agree with Jason. There's not going to be many airplanes left in this environment. I've talked to quite a few high net worth individuals who are looking for airplanes, and that's their question: is there a good supply and demand right now? Because I can, get some favorable arrangements with my bank. So there is some activity there, and people are thinking that we better do something sooner than later.
Excellent. And any final aircraft market updates before we get to the Q&A?
So I know we covered a bunch. We will be releasing our numbers here in the next, week or so. So we're still crunching data. And I think that, one of the things that I want to make sure, at least that our subscribers who use our data every day know, is that we're going to be very cautious this time in terms of having any knee-jerk reactions. And so I think, the more time we have to figure out, there's a couple markets right now, obviously business jet related on the larger cabin class side. And we have some concerns. There's a couple manufacturers we have concerns about as well. But I think, there's just been a lot of, for lack of a better term, just lack of closings in some of these markets. So from a comp perspective, it's become difficult. And so we don't want to penalize an airplane just to penalize it. And so, as Ken always says, the data dictates the market. We don't create the market, we report the market. And so we are still crunching numbers. We're going to hold off on putting out any specific numbers. But yeah, the business jet market is going to be dropping in value pretty much across the board.
Fantastic. Well, looks like we've covered everything. So we'll hop into the Q&A.